So, yeah, so what? So we have a little time for more questions, discussion, or silence, whatever happens. But the door is locked and nobody leaves this room till 5 o'clock, so...
Are those golden chains or iron chains?
But what, the locked door? It depends how you're reacting to this afternoon's meeting. I feel like I have to throw that back to you and say, are they golden or iron? And if it's iron, is the iron rusty? There's worse than iron chains, there are mouldy, rusting iron chains. Yeah. I don't know why I use that image. I mean, I quite like, there's quite a lot in Buddhism I like, quite a lot. There's also quite a lot in it I find a bit repulsive. That bit will probably be cut from the video as well.
I have so many questions, but I know what the answer is going to be. You will say there's no time, there's no self, but right now, given my ignorance, given the fact that I do think that this is the real world, that non-duality is not my natural self, how do I get from here to there?
Oh, I wish I would be such a wealthy person if I could give you that. Yeah. It's unknowable. How would you know, there aren't any rules. I mean, I can't remember if I've used this word, this phrase already this afternoon. I may have done, but this is absolute anarchy. There's no guidelines, there's no rules. I mean, this is not a teaching, it's a description. I mean, this gets turned into a teaching quite often. It's quite obvious if you pick up certain books or look at certain speakers on YouTube that it gets turned into a teaching, but it's not. It's just a description of what happens when, if you like, the natural self re-emerges, is a way of putting it. Because you know, we're born into the natural state and then that's lost and then it can re-emerge. And I would be so happy if I could give a prescription or rules or even guidelines. What I could say is it's possible that some relaxation, I've already said relaxation is the key to Buddhahood, quoting a Buddhist of course, those aren't my words. You know, and they're kind of a clue in that, not that I'm telling you or advising you or recommending that you relax, because there's no one who can do that. But there is just the awareness that relaxation can arise. It might arise. And that is sometimes reported in meetings like this. And when I say meetings like this, I don't just mean, you know, mine. You know, other people hold meetings like that. I mean that, in terms of a character here with an apparent history, that's what I would say. I started to go to meetings like this, and lots of things arose, including, as I said before the tea break, a lot of anger. But one of the things that arose regularly and more and more and more was relaxation. And I mean, I could create a story about that, and the story might kind of map onto reality or not, I don't know, it can't be known. But you know, that might have something to do with the energies in the room. I had a host in Germany who used to arrange meetings for me, and she always said energies, which I found very attractive somehow. Something nice about the thought of energies rather than energies, but you know, who knows? It might be partly to do with the mind exhausting itself and finally giving up. I mean, you know, you started this, but you have lots and lots of questions, and it's kind of like the mind already knows it's not going to get a satisfactory answer. Nevertheless, there's an impulse to ask those questions. And in asking them and then listening to an answer that falls somewhere between making no sense and complete nonsense or whatever, maybe the mind gradually exhausts itself, and maybe there's some kind of benefit in that. You're voicing something very common, very usual, when it's like, when there's this confrontation between, let's say, the self with a small s, the individual self, and non-dual communication, which is making no suggestions and giving no advice, which is a kind of offence to the mind.
So I've heard before with non-duality that they say something like, well, it might just happen, or awakening might just happen. And then I've also heard within non-duality saying that you can't creep up on something that is already here.
Yeah.
So they're both two different things. So someone said, for example, someone's speaking about enlightenment or liberation, and then the next breath is saying, well, there's no such thing because there's only oneness. So technically you could say all there is liberation. So you're already experiencing that. So it's no separate destination. And then in the next breath, someone else will say, well, actually, it could just happen spontaneously. Now, I understand that's like a falling away of the illusion that you're a separate self. But they just, with human beings in general, it just feels like, even when you sort of you resonate with there's no separation, you get pulled back into, oh God, it's like squabbling again, or individuals, oh that person is, and then you go, oh no, I'm doing it again. But so when there's a question like that, is that I understand there's no direct answer, but is it a case of not just, well, there is no other? What you're looking for is already what you are.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's so complex, but also you sort of think it's just so. I think that Tony Parsons said it's just so complex because the mind hates it because it's so simple and it wants it to be a lot more complex.
Yeah. Have you not noticed? I mean, look at world religions and indeed spiritual. Look at Buddhism and what's happened with Buddhism over what seems to be 2,500 years in the story of time. Yeah, the mind loves complications. Give the mind something complicated and it will make it 3 times more complicated. Of course, that's what the mind thrives on. It's fascinating. It's lovely. My mind likes doing that. My mind. The mind of yeah, it's lovely. Find something you're interested in and down you go. Yeah, lovely. This is an insult to the mind. I think I've already said that. Now, the thing you said, there's an awful lot wrapped up. You covered a lot of ground there. And I'm just trying to remember, but sort of going back. Yeah, I know there are, there are the statements out there from some speakers, well, this is already realisation. Yes, of course it is, in a way, everything is, or whatever, and therefore there's nothing to find and no one to find it, and it's just ordinary and I'm being recorded, so I'm being a little bit incautious because I'm going to quote Tony Parsons on this, and I might have got it wrong, in which case, I profoundly apologise before I say it, but it makes absolute sense to me. I think I have heard Tony say, that, how can I put it, having started this, can I actually remember what it is I tried to quote? That for somebody to say, well, everything's liberation, just forget it, because everything's just liberation anyway. It's like a blind man telling you that everything is colour. Yeah, sure, everything is colour, but the blind man doesn't know what they're saying. That's my gloss on it, by the way, that last bit. Tony didn't say that, that's my interpretation of it. So yeah, of course, I'm aware there are, even I have kind of joined the technological age and occasionally watch YouTube. I'm aware that there are people who say that. All I can say is I profoundly disagree. I could go into, those of you who've kind of been here before several or maybe many times will know this, but I could go into this chap called Dennis Waits who wrote a book called The Book of One, right? And he and I, again, we profoundly disagree about this. but his book's very good and it's very clear. I mean, I don't agree with most of what he says, but it's very clear, it's very good in that way. And he gives this description, which I find quite helpful sometimes. I mean, he says there are three kinds of non-duality, so three kinds of there's only oneness. Right? It'll take me about 2.5 to 3 minutes to go through them. Shall I bother?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's Advaita, not non-duality. Advaita, he uses that term. So he says there's traditional Advaita, Neo-Advaita, and Pseudo-Advaita. Okay. Traditional Advaita, basically there is a goal. Call that what you want. Enlightenment, incredibly misleading. Awakening. Liberation, slightly less misleading. Maybe, right? So there's a goal to be reached, and there is a path or methods to reach that goal. So, we all recognise that we're talking about traditional stuff here. We're talking about, the yogic schools of philosophy and meditation and We're talking about Buddhism, maybe Sufism, even within the Western churches, which really lost their way profoundly a very long time ago in the history of time. Even in the Christian churches, in spite of their desperate attempts to kill mystics over the centuries, there are what you could call mystical paths towards, they probably won't call it liberation, but unity or whatever. So that's traditional Advaita. Then there's Neo-Advaita, which according to Dennis Wade, I think very accurately, there is a goal, but there's no path. So the goal is whatever word you want to use, awakening, liberation. I resist the word enlightenment intensely, and we can talk about that later if you want to, but not now. Too confusing if we throw too much in. So Neo-Advaita, there's a goal, but there's no path to that goal, very frustratingly, right? Let us be clear, you are here in a Neo-Advaita talk. And then there's what Dennis Wade rather rudely calls, and maybe not rudely, calls Pseudo-Advaita. So in Pseudo-Advaita there is neither a goal, nor therefore obviously, nor a path to it. So what you kind of referred to at some point in what you were saying, that Pseudo-Advaita, it's nothing to realise, mate, this is it already, suck it up. If you don't like it, suck it up. There are quite a lot of what Dennis would call Pseudo-Advaita speakers on YouTube.
Would all three of them say that there is no individual also?
I think that would be a commonality, yeah. I mean, Dennis is homing in on the differences because he's trying to explain something. But that would be the commonality is there's no self. I mean, my reaction to, the Pseudo-Advaita saying there is no self is, well, that's a bit so what-ish, isn't it? But then,
But the first one you mentioned said the self somehow
Traditional
worked.
advice.
Conditional advice.
Traditional.
Sorry?
Traditional.
Yeah. Seems to suggest that the individual is working towards.
Absolutely.
Something.
The individual that doesn't exist,
The
but
individual that
appears
doesn't
to exist.
Yeah.
And I mean that's at the root of most traditional spiritual paths and traditions and so forth, isn't it?
And the pseudo would not be on a spiritual path.
No, there's no. Well, it might, maybe in terms of daily activity, but it would be irrelevant. It would have no meaning. Yeah.
That was very helpful. No, explaining those three was very
The
helpful.
last thing I set out to do this afternoon is to be helpful. Only, not because I don't want to be helpful, only because I know it's hopeless. Yeah.
Could you tell us your mantra again?
Would you like the one that I got from my guru many years ago? Because of course I can't disclose that. Or do you mean the one that I wrote about? Hopeless, helpless, and meaningless. Yeah. It is hopeless. We are helpless. It is meaningless. Yeah. It came to me in a moment of divine inspiration at one of Nathan Gill's talks long ago, and a friend of mine who was also there, I just blurted it out. I couldn't stop myself. It was like a kriya or the word of God. And a friend of mine came up to me at the tea break and said, "Richard, that was the most depressing thing I've ever heard anybody say." But he then said that it was also wonderful.
It makes perfect sense.
It makes perfect
Perfect
sense.
sense.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be a little bit. I mean, there is no. I mean, in a way, it's nonsense. There is no one for whom it's hopeless, but there is hopelessness. We are in a hopeless case. There is no one, and yet we are in a hopeless case. There's nothing we can do about our predicaments. You know, we're helpless, therefore, and this is all meaningless, which can be heard despairingly and depressingly, or gloriously. It's gloriously meaningless. In the same sense that nothing matters can be heard as depressing or nihilistic or something like that, or it's glorious. It's so freeing. It's so freeing. And imagine for, you know, I mean, maybe you can relate to this personally or not as a character, but imagine someone, for example, who has dedicated their life to the profound meaning of, you know, serving a dualistic God, something like that. You know, everything they do is so important. It matters so much, and you know, today I must flagellate myself a little bit more because I had a lustful thought yesterday. I mean, Buddhists also may do this. Imagine how freeing it may be for that poor lost soul or imaginary person if they really hear that and really get it. It's meaningless. It's meaningless. Isn't that glorious?
It's phenomenal.
It can be heard like that. It's phenomenal. Yeah. Yeah.
It was interesting. I was finding it interesting. You're talking about the different responses to coming to a talk like this. Confusion and anger, and also peace or relaxation. At the same time. So I've just passed through my mind. But it was an indication of where you might, if you're going to identify or feel more at home, you've got a choice.
Can you just spell that very last bit out again?
Well, there seems
You've
to be
got
a
a
choice.
bit more.
Do
You've
you
got
go
to
with
do
the
it.
frustration? It's so frustrating as
Yeah.
before. Or do you go, well, actually, feels very comfortable.
Yeah, when you said it the second time, you threw in a seams, which is exactly it. Yes,
Pardon?
when you said it the second time, you threw in a seams. You said there seems to be a choice, which is exactly it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a choice. In other words, there seems to be a
There
choice.
seems to be
Of
a
course,
choice.
there's no choice because it's not that there's no choice. There's no chooser. But that's how it seems.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can seem like, okay, I can become more and more and more irritated by this torrent of drivel that is flowing over me, or I can relax and just see what happens. It seems like that, yeah. It may seem like that. Yeah.
May seem like that.
Can you explain again the relationship between non-duality and unconditional love?
What I would say is that in the, it sounds like a dangerously pompous phrase, but I'll say it because it popped into my head. In the ultimate seeing of non-duality, I'm hesitating because words are so inadequate. It is seen that this is unconditional love. I want to say this is an outpouring of unconditional love, which is even more of a romantic and misleading phrase. It's just seen. It can't be explained in the same way that, you know, I've said, I've written, and you may well have come across other people who have said and written, you know, that this is nothing and everything. How can it be nothing and everything? This is silence and noise, or the way I put it and some other people put it is this great outpouring of verbiage from here. It's silence making a noise, and movement is stillness moving. And it's like, maybe logically, from a communications point of view, linguistically, that doesn't make any sense at all. Maybe it makes a bit of sense, maybe it makes no sense at all, I don't know. But when it's seen, there's no question. I want to call it an experience, but it isn't an experience because there's nobody there to have the experience. But, you know, that divine puppet or psychophysical organism may be standing in the middle of Piccadilly Circus on the busiest day in summer as the buses and taxis and cars and cyclists whiz round, and all of that movement is stillness. It's stillness moving. And the noise can be deafening, and the buskers and the religious loonies shouting through their megaphones, and all of that noise is silence. It's silence making a noise. Can't be explained, but it may happen. And it's one of the reasons why the kind of, you know, the seeking, the spiritual path seeking may collapse. Because spiritual path seeking tends to be full of wonderful, lovely, magical, romantic stories about seeking out these special places. Nowhere is any more special than anywhere else. There is just as much silence and stillness, and therefore holiness and sacredness in Piccadilly Circus as there is in the oldest monastery in Tibet. Now, I was once told long ago, long before I came across this, I was told by a wonderful English teacher I had who turned out to be a complete charlatan, but he didn't, you know, he had some wonderful teachings before he was exposed as an utter charlatan. So I don't even know if this story is true. Somebody could check it out probably, you know, with Google, that there's a monastery up a mountain in Japan where there has been continuous Buddhist chanting for 800 years. Obviously not by the same monks, but there has never been a moment in those 800 years when there have not been monks chanting in that monastery. When I heard this story as a very spiritually romantic young man, I thought, God, it must be so wonderful to be there, to be in that sacred space, in that the silence, you know, the sacred silence of the chanting. And da, da, da. Well, it's nonsense. It's utter nonsense. It's complete nonsense, because that silence is in Piccadilly Circus, where I know for a fact there has not been continuous Buddhist chanting for 800 years. So it's like we're looking for it out there. There must be some special place, some special person. The Guru can give this to me. I'll go over here for Shaktipat from the Guru's peacock feathers or whatever it might be. You know, this is so it's not. It's so ordinary, but so wonderful. But it's so in the ordinary, and it's at this point in any talk like this that any speaker who's read the Gospel of Thomas will usually quote, it's in the mustard seed. Cleave the wood and I am there. Absolutely.
And as an extension to like Piccadilly Circus, that silence would perhaps even be there in a riot or some sort of...
No, it's only in Piccadilly Circus. You have to go to Piccadilly
I meant it's universal.
Yeah. And now, yeah, absolutely.
It's taking it to another extreme.
Yeah, and again, this is another point at which the mind can start to revolt against this and say, are you telling me that, you know, in a bloody riot, there's stillness and silence and holiness? Don't tell me that. I mean, you can see what the mind makes of that. I can't justify what I'm saying from the mind point of view. I'm just reporting on something that may be seen and is impossible to describe. and cannot be justified by the mind.
Mm.
It's not difficult for the mind to come up with objections to this. And I mean, I often say, if you set up an argument between oneness and the mind will always win. The mind's got all the arguments. So somebody might say, so what you're saying, you know, we have to take this on faith, on trust. No, you don't. You don't have to do anything. In fact, you can't do anything. It's got nothing to do with taking anything on trust or faith, because this isn't a teaching. You take teachings on trust.
Mm.
I mean, even at school, you know, the teacher tells you that the French for teacup is tasse, and you take it on trust that when you go to Paris and ask for a tasse de thé, you're not going to make a fool of yourself because the teacher's malevolent and tasse really means elephant. And you just ask for an elephant of tea. I mean, you know, teaching is taken on trust. This isn't a teaching.
Mm. Partly because there's no teacher and no student.
Partly because of that, but yes, absolutely, partly because of that. That also applies to the apparent French teacher and pupil.
Yeah.
Partly because of that, but partly in the more obvious sense that there's no instruction being given.
Yes,
It's
of
not a
course.
teaching, it's a description.
One of my mantras with regard to non-duality is no teacher, no seeker, and in fact nobody there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No seeker, no guru, yeah.
Mm.
Have you ever met anyone who's enlightened?
I can't answer that question because I avoid the term. I find it an unhelpful term because it implies, firstly it implies a state rather than a process. Everything's process. Everything's process. And secondly, because it attaches, I mean, I think the very idea of enlightenment is misleading, and then it attaches that idea to a person, and people don't exist. A person doesn't exist. There's only process, it's only movement. So I do use the words awakening and liberation. I'm a bit uncomfortable about even those, but as I've written books using those terms, I can't get away from them. But, yeah, I mean, if people want to use the term enlightening, does that work? As a process, well, use it, yeah. But no, so, I mean, if I just take the question really at face value, I could just answer a simple no, but then I'd have to explain why I'm saying no to that. I've certainly come across a good few people where I feel that what I'm talking about here has been seen. Yeah. None of them seem to me to be remotely enlightened. That includes myself, of course. You know, if we kind of look at the stories of, you know, there's lots of stories of enlightened beings. I mean, again, this is what the person, the individual self, will latch onto. You know, projection. I mean, one of the things that tends to fall away, you know, when this is seen, is maybe all, but certainly quite a lot of the projections that we make onto other people. So the kind of whole thing about, oh yes, they're an enlightened being, that can only happen, you know, when we're projecting. I mean, it's very easy now. Oh, thank the dear Lord for YouTube. I mean, it's very easy now on YouTube to sort of find a meeting going on somewhere and see this massive projection. I mean, you know, look at, again, I'll probably have to edit this out later, but yeah, look at Muji. So there are characters who play the projection game absolutely beautifully. You know, here I have the gurus, you know, the direct gurus. The eyes, the guru eyes or whatever, and there in the audience are the devotees, the chelas, projecting all their longing. all their longing onto this individual. And then, of course, the tragedy, and again, I really am not talking about losing, I'm just talking in general. Then, of course, the tragedy when the guru turns out to have feet of clay. We bow down to the guru's feet, don't we? It's kind of weird that tradition is there, that we bow down to the guru's feet, because when we bow down to the guru's feet, we are most likely to notice that they're made of clay. So then when we discover that the guru's feet are made of clay, and they've been rogering not one, not two, but maybe in my own guru's case, 3 of their female devotees. When I say at the same time, I don't literally mean that. And then we go bang like that, and we knock them off the pedestal, and then our heart is broken. And then maybe we become cynical, or maybe we just set out to find another guru until we notice that their feet too are made of clay. And then it all becomes wonderfully irrelevant when this is seen as part of the play of light. Swami Muktananda, who was a sort of, guru that invited fantastic projections, and some people would say very clearly was revealed as having feet of clay, whether rightly or not, he called his autobiography Play of Consciousness. It's a play, Leela. But we take it so desperately seriously, we can't help it as people. We can't help it as people to take it desperately seriously. I've followed a few charlatans in my life, and I have to say that by and large they tend to be great fun. It's not time wasted. Just for the entertainment value, never mind anything you might learn from them.
I've got a question about memory. My memories feel more real than things that I imagine. But would you say that memory and imagination are essentially the same mechanism?
In the sense that we are talking here, each is just something that's arising out of nothing and falling away. So we could call it all thought, and then we differentiate with those sort of, this is memory, this is imagination, this is memory of a dream, so it's a kind of a memory of an imagining that I had or whatever. We can make these differences, but in terms of what we're talking about here, it's all just, it has to sound like it's time-based. I can't help that. It's like, that's the next thing that's happening. A memory comes. An imagining comes. A memory of a dream I had last night, apparently, comes, which is a memory of an imagining. Yeah, it's all just the next thing arising, the next thing arising, the next thing arising. It becomes important for the person in a very obvious way that they are able to differentiate between these. And when people lose the ability to differentiate between these, they tend to get into serious trouble in terms of the, in inverted commas, actual world, the real world out there, the real apparent dream world out there. But essentially, it's just the next thing happening. One thing at a time, pretending that there is time. There's the noticing of a movement. There's a memory of someone I spoke to yesterday. There's an imagining of some place I'd like to go to but have never been to. Suddenly it's noticed that this room has got rather cold. There's the sound of a chair creaking. There's a noticing that a hand's just moved. There's another memory, something that happened last week. It's just the next thing happening, the next thing happening. And it feels like, because for most of us, most of the time, it's such a constant, we could say just a flow of impressions. It's such a constant flow of impressions that it creates the illusion, we might say, that there is something solid there, in here, that's happening to. So there's a person here who has a memory and an imagining. No, it's just a memory and an imagining. The bit of that that's illusory is the person who seems to be having that.
So without the person, does the reality of the memory sort of dissipate? Or is it no longer seen as...
All I can say to that is that as a general rule, and this is by no means necessarily the case, but as a general rule, as I was saying much earlier this afternoon, the intensity of memory tends to loosen its grip, particularly memories that are uncomfortable. So a lot of memories accrete around regret, guilt. Oh God, I wish I hadn't said that, or I wish I hadn't done that. Regret, guilt, possibly fear in the future, fear of some kind of consequence from something that I've done in the past. So it's common when this is seen that those kind of sticky feelings that go with the memories tend to loosen or dissipate, or perhaps disappear completely, so that memory is then held more lightly. It's not such a heavy burden. Going back to the metaphor of the chains round the ankles, like some of those chains have fallen off, or maybe they've all fallen off. Yeah. So this can provide a kind of a release from the self-torture that often goes on about the past. Yeah.
It struck me possibly that when faced with descriptions that are apparently contradictory and impossible, to look at it in a poetic sense is helpful, rather than just as poetry, because poetry somehow allow impossible things and you can absorb it. That's all.
Can you give any examples of what you regard as an impossible or contradictory description?
Well, let me try and remember what you said. There's no time, and yet things seem to have time. The Piccadilly Circus is silent and still.
Yeah.
In the silence, as soon as it arises, take that one. It's a perfectly good one.
Yeah.
It's a very nice one. In a poetic sense, just the way this is built, it can be reflected on. But looked at in a mental sense, it becomes impossible. That was all.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
see it as a poetic pointer.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, and I mean it's kind of and the mind will try and make sense of what's said, but can't be understood by the mind. It can only be seen. But from the sitting in the chair in the front, and even though I have a background as a lecturer in literature, so I've taught poetry and I hope I appreciate it and da 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 da.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, what I would say to that is that when I'm talking about the stillness and silence of Piccadilly Circus being the same as the noise and movement of Piccadilly Circus, I am talking literally. I'm not talking poetically. I'm trying to describe something which is admittedly indescribable, but I'm trying to describe it literally. I'm not being poetic.
Yeah, point taken. I wasn't suggesting that you were. Okay. No,
I'll leave the poetry to Rumi.
Okay.
I kind of noticed that earlier as well, that it's precisely that kind of language that is the undoing of the me, or the mind.
Yeah.
There's a level of, because the mind can't comprehend it,
Yeah.
and yet there's a resonating.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and there's even a desire for more.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you're in.
Yeah, which may very well come from something other than the mind, but don't ask me what the heck that is. Because I can't answer that question, no one can. Yeah. So the mind may be baffled, infuriated, bored, whatever, and yet there is something here that, I mean, you know, we can use phrases like it's oneness recognising itself, it's stillness recognising itself. I've used those phrases, they're lovely, they are quite poetic in a way, but what do they mean? Well, the mind, I don't know what they mean, because the mind can't say what they mean.
I've got one of mine, when the boundless meets the bound, something energetic can happen.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Yeah. I think that's a very good description of what can happen and may happen at talks like this.
Absolutely.
And I really mean like this. I mean, there are plenty of other speakers. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, when I was started going to Tony Parsons, there was something else going on other than simply fury and boredom. There was a lot of fury and boredom. Well, there was fury and boredom and the awareness that if I stuck it out, there'd be a nice group of people to go over the road and have a drink with afterwards. But there was something else going on. That wasn't enough to get me up to Hampstead every month. There's something else going on which is ineffable, genuinely ineffable, that can't be put into words. And remember, I think it was Alan Watts said that, remember, we're trying to F the ineffable here. Or was it Alan Watts or somebody else who said, I'm trying to take some of the effing out of the ineffable.
Yeah, I'm very much finding that there's something else always going on.
Yeah.
It's nothing to do with reading a book.
Yeah.
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 It's always something else.
Yeah. It's strange. I mean, it's like it's not in the words, yet maybe it wouldn't be happening without the words.
The words are a catalyst.
Yeah.
Almost,
It's definitely not in the ideas, and yet maybe it wouldn't be happening without the ideas. Maybe it would. People go on silent retreats.
Yeah.
I don't. I'm too gabby, but some people do.
Yeah. What would happen if there was a bunch of people that are interested in non-dual and they start using slightly different language? That basically the world exists out there and it's very materialistic. What if they're materialistic and it's very me-based, individual-based, the world out there, the walking, talking world where there's a me and an individual. But if there was an environment where there was more of an acceptance of this type of work or this type of person, non-person, sorry, and at the same time there was less of an emphasis on always reasserting the self, of the sense of self, using language. Yeah.
Maybe there'd be less mayhem. Who knows? I mean, something we haven't touched on, and maybe it's a bit late to touch it. Maybe I shouldn't mention it at all. One of the things that, an easy way to start fights with people, don't even have to talk about non-duality, there's no person, is free will. Free will and choice, which we haven't touched on today. Maybe that's a blessing. But, if you, even on the level of kind of thinking about this, that you can get this very, very ill thought out, very sort of surface reaction about, oh, that's terrible, you know, if people, oh, you know, be mayhem, anarchy or whatever. Well, you can actually, I think, argue very coherently that probably the world would be a much better place if we abandoned the thought, you know, any kind of idea that there was free will. And I'm not going to go into it now for various reasons, one of which there isn't time. Thank goodness. But, you know, maybe the world would be a much better place if nothing else changed, but we just abandoned the belief in free will. But in a way, that's kind of not what we're talking about here. Because we're just talking about something which is a natural seeing. There was a big conference in London a few years ago that I took part in called Dream Bus Live.
I know.
Yeah, and it seemed to me, I mean, I was there for quite a lot of it. I was speaking at it and taking part in a panel at the end. And it seemed to me very early on that this audience split very neatly down the middle between, like, I can't remember which side of the room they were on. But like, half the audience seemed to be, quite tuned in to what was being said and, you know, quite with it. The other half, I hadn't come across this before, not so clearly, like they somehow got hold of the idea of non-duality. But right, now we can use this to save the world. It's like, what? What are you talking about? They're absolutely convinced, right. What we're going to do is get out there and spread this like apostles or missionaries, and then the world will be a better place. Well, good luck. So the mind, obviously, I mean, you know, I'm sorry, I'm being a bit cruel there and a bit glib, you know, it's just that, you know, the mind always, like Tony says the mind is a businessman, you know, so the mind always wants, whatever's there, it wants to get hold of it and say, okay, now how can I make a profit out of this? So the mind hears non-duality, if it doesn't just reject it, which is the easiest thing to do, gets hold of some of the ideas that, okay, now how can I use this to make the world a better place? Make a profit out of it. It's just kind of what the dear old mind does.
With a strong emphasis on preserving the me or the I.
Oh, of course.
Yes, of course.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because after all, if I'm making the world a better place, then I'm feeling I am a better me. I'm feeling better about myself. I'm noticing my barnacles and lesions a little less. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And I'm making the world a better place for me.
I'm making the world a better place for me. Yeah, and one of the things I kind of watched a lot of people over the years go through, I'm going to call it the non-duality mill, as in something draws us to this in innocence. And then there's the terrible shock of, what the fuck's going on? And then getting, you know, drawn into this. And one of the things that a lot of people find refreshing is that quite often what happens is that, I'm using the words very carefully here, moralism, morality, neither here nor there, forget about it for now. Moralism tends to drop away, or much diminish. So you often get people come to this who've had a long history, like I had on the spiritual path, and you know, we picked up a lot of moralistic ideas, lots of shoulds and shouldn'ts and oughts and so forth, and they tend to fall away with this, which in itself has no value, but nevertheless may be quite relaxing. And what is relaxation? It's the nearest thing to Buddhahood here and now. That's probably quite a good line to end on. Is it 5 o'clock?
So you've got 4 minutes, I think.
Oh, well, we can't shortchange it. So, last chance if there's anything else to say.
I was just going to say,
Okay,
with the, these are just words, with the understanding or the belief that there isn't free choice and will comes that relaxation.
Well, yeah, I mean,
because as soon as free will and choice diminishes,
Yeah.
then that relaxation has to.
And of course, I realise now with what you say that I kind of spoke carelessly and a bit thoughtlessly, because of course that's not actually what this is saying. This is not saying there is no free will or choice. It is saying there is no person
Yes.
who could exercise. So the question of free will and choice doesn't even arise. So there's a huge difference between saying There's no free will or choice, which suggests, there is a person, but that person is somehow helpless, an automaton or whatever. That's completely different. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there is no person. Therefore, the question of free will and choice doesn't even arise. Yeah. It's good that you said that, because it allowed me to correct that, because that was quite misleading what I said. Yeah, in a way.
And I think that's how people get confused about the nihilism bit.
Oh, absolutely.
Nihilism. They think that there's a person who's doing nothing versus how can something be done if there's no person.
Yeah. One of the first talks I gave, somebody who was actually a friend of mine said, nevertheless, very ferociously, I can't see the difference between what you're saying and nihilism. Well, nihilism, there's a person for whom nothing has any meaning, and that's what? How can you confuse that with this? The whole basis of this is there is no one. This is and another action. It's solipsism. Well, solipsism, I'm a person. I'm the only person that exists. How can you confuse that with what's being said here? It's like you're really not paying attention if you think that this is nihilistic or solipsistic. The same person then went on to say, so what you're telling me is I can go out and murder somebody on the streets and it doesn't matter. What? How can you hear that? There is no one to choose, This was a friend of mine I know for some time, and I think I could guarantee that she did not have the character of a murderer. She was a very nice person. And then there's, I think it's Moody's response that I like very much as well. When somebody asks him, so what you're saying is it doesn't matter if I go out and kill somebody, something like that, because this is all just a dream. And he said, well, no. Something like, well, no, it doesn't matter as long as you don't mind being hunted down by the dream police and tried in a dream court and sent to a dream prison. In other words, there's a character. Until death, there's a character. And for that character, there is action and apparent action and apparent consequence. So, But then, you can roll it back more fundamentally than... I think I'm going to sit here and say I prefer my answer to Moody's. Moody's answer was good, but mine was better. Because, Moody is pointing that out. And great, it's good that he did. But roll it back a bit before that. And it's like, well, excuse me, who's going to make the choice to go out and murder somebody? You don't look like that kind of character. I could be wrong, but you don't look like that kind of character. So in a sense, it's, I don't want to be rude to the person who asked the question, but in a sense it's not a real question, is it? It's just an attempt by the mind to keep its territory staked out and say, you are not going to depose me from this is my territory, the mind, and I'm in control of it, and you're not going to depose me from it.
It's defiance.
It's defiance, yeah. And without me here, there'd just be anarchy and everybody would be rioting on the streets. Nonsense.
And for me, Moody's answer is an adequate reply.
Ah,
Yours opens up something.
Oh, thank
within,
you.
Yeah, something.
Bless you.
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah, I'll give you your payment after. That must be it, mustn't it? I think that's a very good place to... Thank you. Thank you for being here.